America just declared economic war on its best friend, and what comes next could reshape the entire world order. Shockwaves are spreading across every trading floor on the planet right now. The United States, the single most powerful economy in human history, just aimed its heaviest economic weapon not at China, not at Russia, not at Iran, but directly at Canada. The nation that has stood shoulder to shoulder with America through 2 world wars, through Korea, through Afghanistan, through every crisis that mattered for over a century. And tonight that relationship is on fire. But the tariffs everyone is talking about are not the real story. The real story is what is hiding underneath them, and almost nobody is paying attention to it. By the time you understand what is actually happening here, you will never look at this conflict the same way again. It began without warning. No diplomatic buildup, no months of tense negotiations broadcast across cable news. One executive order, one signature, one announcement that landed on the global stage like a detonation. President Donald Trump imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on Canadian imports entering the United States. Not a targeted measure aimed at one disputed product. Not a symbolic gesture designed to gain leverage at a negotiating table. A comprehensive economic strike covering steel, aluminum, lumber, dairy, energy, automobiles, and auto parts. The entire industrial backbone of the Canadian economy hit all at once, with no advance notice and no opportunity to respond before the damage was already done. The scope was breathtaking. In a single afternoon, the cost of doing business across the most integrated border on Earth jumped by a quarter. Factories in Ontario that ship parts to Michigan every morning woke up to a new reality where every shipment now carries a financial penalty. Lumber mills in British Columbia that supply construction projects across the American West saw their competitive advantage evaporate overnight. Energy companies operating pipelines that carry 4 million barrels of Canadian crude into the United States every single day began running emergency calculations on what these tariffs mean for the price of gasoline from New York to California. And then came the language. The words that accompanied the tariffs hit even harder than the numbers. Trump called Canada a national security threat. He invoked emergency powers that are designed for use against hostile nations, not allies. He questioned Canadian sovereignty openly, casually, as though a nation of 40 million people with its own constitution, its own military, its own democratic institutions, was simply a problem to be absorbed. He floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state with the tone of someone discussing a minor real estate acquisition, and he framed the entire action as self-defense, claiming that drugs and migrants flowing across the Canadian border justified treating the entire nation as an adversary. This is where things get serious. Because invoking national security is not just rhetoric. Under American law, it unlocks extraordinary presidential power. It bypasses Congress. It sidesteps the World Trade Organization. It transforms trade policy into something that functions with the speed and unilateral authority of a military command. And once that door is opened, once an ally is officially classified as a security threat, the rules of the relationship change in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Ottawa's response came within hours. Prime Minister Trudeau, standing before a row of Canadian flags with the expression that mixed controlled fury with genuine disbelief, announced retaliatory tariffs on American goods. Billions of dollars worth of U.S. products would now face matching duties at the Canadian border. But the targets were not random. They were chosen with precision that would make a military strategist proud. Bourbon from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, steel products from Pennsylvania, consumer goods from states that form the political foundation of Trump's coalition. Every single product on Canada's retaliation list came from a region that matters on election night. Ottawa was not just responding to an economic attack. Ottawa was conducting political warfare with a trade policy scalpel. But to understand why this moment matters far beyond the immediate economic pain, you need to understand what Canada actually represents in the architecture of American power. And this is something most people have never stopped to think about. Canada is not just a friendly neighbor that shares a hockey culture and a long border. Canada is the single largest supplier of foreign energy to the United States, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than all of OPEC combined in certain categories. 4 million barrels of crude oil flow south every day through a pipeline network so vast and so critical that disrupting it would send American gas prices into orbit within weeks. Canadian natural gas heats homes across the entire northern tier of American states. Canadian uranium fuels American nuclear reactors. Canadian hydroelectricity powers cities in New York and New England. The energy relationship between these two nations is not a line item on a trade spreadsheet. It is a strategic lifeline, and it just got tangled in a political war. And energy is only the beginning. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of critical minerals to the United States. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, zinc, potassium, rare earth elements. These are the materials that go into every advanced weapons system the Pentagon operates. They go into the semiconductors that power American technology. They go into the batteries that the entire electric vehicle industry depends on. Without Canadian minerals, the supply chains that sustain American technological and military dominance do not function. That is not an exaggeration. That is a material fact that the Department of Defense itself has documented in reports that are publicly available for anyone willing to read them. So when tariffs are imposed on Canadian goods, understand what is actually being disrupted. This is not about protecting American dairy farmers from Canadian competition. This is about the most deeply integrated economic relationship on the planet. A relationship where a single automobile assembled in Detroit might cross the Canadian border 6 or 7 times during production. Raw materials move north, get processed, move south, get assembled, move north again, get finished, and move south one final time before reaching a dealership. Imposing a 25% tariff on that process does not protect American manufacturing. It breaks it. It introduces a tax at every stage of production that makes the final product more expensive for American consumers while simultaneously destroying the logic that led those factories to exist in the first place. The markets understood this instantly. The Canadian dollar dropped. The Toronto Stock Exchange hemorrhaged billions, but American markets bled too. Auto stocks fell because every major American automaker depends on Canadian parts. Energy stocks wobbled because the tariffs threatened to disrupt the crude oil flows that keep American refineries running at capacity. Retailers saw their projected margins collapse because the raw materials they import from Canada just got 25% more expensive. The pain was not confined to one side of the border. It radiated in every direction because that is what happens when you attack your own supply chain. But here is what most people don't know. The tariffs are not really about trade. They never were. Economists on both sides of the border, including many who are sympathetic to the administration's broader goals, have pointed out a fact that is inconvenient for the official narrative. The U.S. Canada trade relationship is already remarkably balanced. When you account for services, investment flows, intellectual property, and the integrated nature of cross-border manufacturing, there is no massive deficit being exploited by Canada. The numbers that get cited in press conferences are cherry-picked from goods-only trade data and stripped of context that would make them look far less alarming. The trade deficit with Canada is not a crisis. It is a statistical artifact of how two deeply connected economies measure transactions that cross a political line in the middle of a shared production system. So if the tariffs are not solving a real trade problem, what are they actually for? And what happened next changed everything. Because behind the public spectacle, behind the press conferences and the retaliatory tariff lists and the furious social media posts on both sides, a much more significant game is being played. And that game is about power, not economic power in the narrow sense of who sells more goods to whom. Power in the fundamental sense of how the United States relates to its allies. Whether the strongest nation in the Western world treats its partnerships as relationships of mutual benefit or as hierarchies of dominance and submission. In the strategic framework driving these decisions, other nations are not partners. They are subordinates who have been allowed to prosper under American protection and should be grateful enough to accept whatever terms Washington dictates. The tariffs on Canada serve the same function as a warship sailing through contested waters. They are a demonstration. A reminder that the United States holds the ability to inflict catastrophic economic damage on any nation, including its closest friend, at any moment, for any reason, with no warning and no negotiation. And the message is not meant only for Ottawa. It is meant for Berlin, for Tokyo, for Seoul, for Canberra, for every capital in the world that has built its economic strategy around reliable access to American markets. The message is simple and brutal. Access is not a right. It is a privilege, and privileges can be revoked. Canada's response went far beyond retaliatory tariffs. And this is the part of the story that should genuinely concern strategic thinkers in Washington. Within days of the announcement, Canadian officials were holding conversations with the European Union about accelerating trade agreements. Talks with the United Kingdom about a bilateral trade deal gained sudden momentum. Outreach to Japan and South Korea intensified. Discussions with India and the ASEAN nations moved from theoretical to operational. And most significantly, Canadian officials began openly discussing expanded energy trade with China. That single development has strategic implications that dwarf anything the tariffs themselves could accomplish. The United States has spent decades trying to limit Chinese access to reliable energy supplies. American foreign policy across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia has been shaped by the objective of keeping energy choke points under the control of American allies. And now, because of a trade war with Canada, the door is opening for China to secure access to Canadian oil, Canadian natural gas, and Canadian critical minerals through Pacific Coast infrastructure that Canada now has every political and economic incentive to build as fast as possible. The global reaction has been a slow-motion earthquake. European leaders watched the Canada tariffs with a recognition that chilled diplomatic conversations across the continent. If this could happen to Canada, the most loyal and least threatening ally the United States has, then no European nation is safe from the same treatment. Germany began accelerating discussions about reducing dependence on American financial infrastructure. France renewed calls for European strategic autonomy. The European Commission launched internal reviews of trade vulnerability to American policy shifts. The foundational assumption of the transatlantic economic relationship that the United States would maintain a predictable, rules-based trading system was officially declared unreliable. In the Asia-Pacific, the tremors were equally significant. Japan and South Korea, both sheltered under the American security umbrella and deeply dependent on American market access, began quiet internal strategy sessions about diversification. Australia, a Five Eyes intelligence partner and close American ally, confronted uncomfortable questions about whether its own mineral exports might someday face similar treatment. And China, observing every fracture with the strategic patience of a civilization that measures time in centuries, recognized that it did not need to defeat the Western alliance. It simply needed to wait while the Western alliance defeated itself. Military analysts have raised concerns that go far beyond economics. NATO, the most successful military alliance in history, depends on trust. Trust that commitments will be honored. Trust that sacrifices will be remembered. Trust that the strongest member will not use its power to humiliate the others. Canada has been a NATO member since the alliance's founding. Canadian soldiers fought in Korea. They served in the Balkans. They bled in Afghanistan for over a decade, embedded with American forces, taking casualties in Kandahar while the American public barely noticed. Canada invoked Article 5 after September 11th, the only time in history that mutual defense clause was ever triggered, and did so in defense of the United States. Treating that nation as a security threat is not a negotiating tactic. It is an insult to every Canadian soldier who ever wore a uniform in an American-led operation. And the institutional damage it inflicts on the alliance structure that protects the entire Western world cannot be measured in trade statistics. NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that protects North America from missile attack and airspace incursion, is a bilateral institution that depends on seamless cooperation between American and Canadian forces. The radar stations monitoring Russian bomber approaches over the Arctic are staffed by both nations. The underwater sensors tracking submarine movements in the Pacific and Atlantic depend on shared intelligence. If the political relationship between Washington and Ottawa deteriorates severely enough to strain military cooperation, the security consequences extend to every American citizen, not just every Canadian one. Social media amplified the crisis with a speed that outpaced official communications. Canadian citizens launched coordinated boycotts of American products. Hashtags calling for domestic tourism instead of American vacations trended nationally. American border communities that depend on Canadian shoppers and tourists reported immediate drops in cross-border traffic. Small businesses on both sides of the line began feeling the impact within days, not months, as consumer sentiment shifted faster than any tariff schedule. And inside Washington, something unexpected emerged. Dissent from within the president's own political coalition. Republican senators representing border states, auto manufacturing regions, and agricultural communities that sell billions to Canada began publicly questioning the strategy. Not the principle of negotiating better trade terms that remained popular, but the specific decision to treat Canada with the same hostility reserved for geopolitical adversaries. The political cost of the tariffs was materializing in districts that the administration could not afford to lose. So what happens next? The honest answer is that multiple scenarios are now in play, and each carries consequences that extend far beyond the next news cycle. The first possibility is sustained escalation. Both sides maintain their tariffs. The economic damage compounds week after week. Supply chains that took decades to build begin fragmenting. Factories close. Workers are laid off. Consumer prices rise. And both governments face political pressure that pushes them further apart rather than closer together. In Washington, the pressure is to demonstrate strength by refusing to back down. In Ottawa, the pressure is to demonstrate independence by accelerating diversification away from American markets. In this scenario, the damage becomes structural and permanent. The integrated North American economy begins to separate along the borderline, and rebuilding it will require a generation of political will that may never materialize. The second possibility is a negotiated resolution. Back-channel diplomacy produces a deal that gives both sides enough political cover to step back. Tariffs are reduced or suspended. Specific Canadian concessions on immigration or dairy access are packaged as victories for the American side. Canadian sovereignty is quietly reaffirmed. Markets stabilize. The immediate crisis passes. But even in this best-case scenario, the trust that was broken does not heal with a handshake. Every future Canadian government will remember this moment. Every future Canadian economic strategy will include contingency plans for the next time American leverage is aimed at Ottawa. The vulnerability has been exposed, and no responsible government will allow it to persist. The third possibility is the one that changes the global map. Canada pivots decisively toward trade diversification, building Pacific Coast energy infrastructure, deepening European partnerships, opening new corridors to Asian markets. The United States finds itself with a northern neighbor that is economically less dependent and therefore politically less aligned. The Western alliance structure loosens. Middle powers around the world draw the conclusion that American partnership is transactional and unreliable, and begin hedging their bets with alternative great powers. And China fills the spaces that America has voluntarily abandoned, not through military force or ideological conquest, but through the patient, steady accumulation of economic relationships with nations that the United States has pushed away. The bigger picture here is not about tariffs or trade deficits or any single policy dispute. What we are witnessing is a fundamental test of the system that has sustained American global leadership for 3/4 of a century. Since 1945, the United States has maintained its position at the center of the global order through a combination of military power and economic architecture. But the economic architecture was never just about American prosperity. It was about creating a system that other nations wanted to belong to. The bargain was straightforward: align with American interests, and you gain access to American markets, American capital, American technology, and American security guarantees. It was not a charity. America benefited enormously from this arrangement. But it worked because other nations believed the terms were stable, predictable, and fundamentally fair. The Canada tariffs shatter that belief, not because tariffs are inherently destructive. They are a normal tool of trade policy used by every nation, but because using them against your closest ally, without warning, under the banner of national security, while simultaneously questioning that ally's right to exist as an independent nation, sends a message that cannot be unsent. The message is that no relationship is safe, no alliance is permanent, no amount of loyalty or sacrifice earns immunity from American economic coercion. And once the world absorbs that message, the calculations change everywhere. Nations that have built their strategies around American partnership begin building alternatives. Supply chains that run through American markets begin rerouting. Financial systems that depend on the dollar begin exploring other options. Military alliances that assumed American reliability begin hedging. None of this happens overnight, but all of it happens. And the cumulative effect over years and decades is the gradual erosion of the very dominance that the tariffs were supposed to protect. There is a concept that military historians know well. It is called imperial overreach. It describes the moment when a great power, intoxicated by its own strength, begins using that strength so aggressively and so indiscriminately that it undermines the very foundations of its own position. The wars become too expensive, the allies become too alienated, the enemies become too numerous, and the empire discovers, always too late, that power exercised without wisdom is power consumed. Economic power follows the same logic. And tonight, as tariffs bite into the most productive bilateral relationship on Earth, as allies quietly begin planning their exits, as rivals patiently catalog every fracture in the Western alliance, the question is not whether America is strong enough to win a trade war with Canada. Of course it is. America is strong enough to win a trade war with almost anyone. The question is whether winning this war is worth what it costs. Not in dollars, in trust, in alliances, in the quiet, invisible architecture of relationships that transforms raw power into durable leadership. The 5,525 miles of border between the United States and Canada have been undefended for longer than most nations have existed. That border is not undefended because neither side has an army. It is undefended because neither side believed it needed one. It stands as the most remarkable monument to mutual trust between two nations anywhere on the planet. A daily, living proof that power does not have to mean domination, that neighbors can choose cooperation over coercion, that strength and decency are not opposites. Tonight, that monument is cracking, not from an external attack, not from a foreign adversary, from the inside. And the question that should keep every strategist in Washington awake tonight is not what Canada will do next. It is what the rest of the world is learning from watching America treat its closest friend this way. Because every nation on Earth is watching, and every nation on Earth is drawing conclusions that will shape the next 50 years of global power. The border is still there, the flags still fly on both sides, but something has changed in the space between them, something that took a century to build and may take only one presidency to destroy. And in the silence where trust used to live, something else is growing, something colder, something that history has a very specific name for: distance.